Welcome back to Quarantine Conversations. I'm Wesley Boudelier, and I'm here with a very special guest. You've seen him in all sorts of projects, the Muppets, Fraggle Rock, just about anything that's had puppets in it for the past few decades. It is Mr. Steve Whitmire. How are you, Steve?
I'm great, Wesley. I'm glad we got a chance to do this in our quarantine situation.
Yeah, I'm very excited to talk to you again. I know we met, I don't know if you remember, about a year ago when you were at Dragon Con here in Atlanta.
Yeah. I do. And I think you've called in on Cave-In once or twice.
Yeah, that was the premiere of Cave-In was the day I met you at Dragon Con.
Oh, that's right. You know, that kind of slipped my mind. Yeah, we, no particular reason, but we wanted to get going on it. And originally the idea with Cave-In was going to be that we would do this live at Comic-Cons. And we actually tried that in Louisville, Kentucky at one of the Galaxy cons. And it was fine, but it was really hectic and frustrating. And what I figured out was that it was going to be very difficult to keep doing these because we had such an unstable internet connection. I want to do them live from the show and get, you know, the celebrities who were there at the Comic-Cons to come on and be guests. And we do have one on tape that's never been seen. Someday I'll use some of the video from that. But so that was the plan. That's why we planned it for that weekend around Dragon Con in Atlanta. And then we had sort of decided to stop doing it by then and started doing it in our little studio facility here. So we basically left, you know, Dragon Con early and raced up to Marietta and did our thing.
You know? Yeah, I was gonna say that's a busy day right there.
It was, but the fun thing about it was that we got to do a little bit of kind of, you know, promoting it a little bit at Dragon Con that day, and then people were able to tune in and see it that night, and then we could talk about it the next day, you know, at Dragon Con, which was fun.
Yeah. I remember you had the booth set up with all sorts of advertisements for it because I had thought you had actually been hacked on Instagram, but it was all to promote the series.
I've sort of backed off that a little bit, but I thought it was a great way to start the whole thing. You know, I thought, well, I wanted to do this character who was an internet troll who was hacking people's websites, and I thought, well, you know, you can be as mean as you want in the world today, but I didn't want him to be so mean that he was off-putting. So I thought, how can I have a character who can be pretty nasty to somebody? And I thought, well, somebody has to be me. So it's just, you know, I'm trolling myself. So it worked out well to do that. And then that website has since crashed and burned. We had serious malware problems, mostly because I didn't really know how to set up a website. As you and I are doing this now at the end of August in 2020, I'm just on the verge of publishing a new website, which should happen in the next few weeks. And there'll be a blog there, and, you know, people can send in questions, and I will try to answer those Muppet questions or whatever they want to talk about, not just Muppets, but puppetry in general and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. Well, I got a few of those questions for you here. It might answer some stuff that people were thinking about. I figured we start kind of from the beginning. I was going to ask you how you got your start and how you really got interested in puppetry to begin with.
Yeah, I think my real interest in puppetry, an interest that would have led me into wanting to kind of do this, you know, as a life's work, was probably Sesame Street. I was aware of the Muppets before that when I was little, like 5 or 6 years old. Jim was already doing Rolf on this show called The Jimmy Dean Show, which was in the early 1960s. And, you know, my parents used to let me stay up late and watch it, whatever time it was. And I remember being really, you know, like most of the people who saw it, I was very drawn to Rolf. And at that time, that was like black and white television, you know, so Rolf was this gray thing with a big black mouth, you know, and I don't remember, the only thing I remember specifically that they did was Lassie, the collie was on there, like the real collie, and Rolf had a crush on her, and they did this whole relationship thing. And, you know, in the years to come, Jim, at that point, the Muppets were sort of just an act that went on variety shows of the time. And I would make sure I watched all of those, and I would see all those. And the Muppets were just always there, you know, periodically doing these things. And when Sesame Street hit in the late 60s, I was too old for what they were teaching on Sesame Street, but because it was on every single day and the Muppets were there. And at that point, they were so pure and just wonderful characters. And I was very drawn to them. And I was about 10 years old. And I just decided that I just wanted to start making these characters, and figuring out how they work. And it was more than just being drawn to the Muppets as characters. I wanted to know the inside of it, how you build these things and how you perform with these things. And I just became really obsessed by it and started trying to build them. Yeah.
And then I know from there, you're from Atlanta, as I am, and you went on to perform at the World of Sid and Marty Krofft, which I've covered on this YouTube channel before. You've seen the little mini documentary we did about that, where it wasn't open for very long, but you were there for that as a puppeteer.
I was, all through high school, I was the nerdy puppet guy. Whenever I had to do reports at school, stuff like that, I would always the teacher would always actually want me to do them with puppets. So I always, it was a great way to meet girls when I was in high school, because I was a very nerdy kid, but they all wanted to be on my team because they knew they'd get a good grade. So that was great. They may not have been good puppeteers, but who cared? So my friends and I would always do our reports, like history class. We would do something with puppets, and I built the characters. So by the time I was about, I guess, 18 or so, I had done a lot of corporate-y things and built puppets for other people and birthday parties and stuff like that. And the World of Sid and Marty Krofft opened, and I didn't even know about it. A buddy of mine who I went to high school with, a guy named Gary Kepke, who's also an Atlanta person, originally from Michigan, but has been here for years, was the world champion ventriloquist at that point, at his age, like 18, 19. And so there's obviously a crossover between puppetry and ventriloquism to some degree. And Gary went down, they were looking for a ventriloquist for one of the parts at Sid and Marty Krofft. It was this kind of a cool effect. What you did at Krofft is you went into this building and you went up this giant, the world's longest freestanding escalator. And when you got to the top, you get off of this thing and you worked your way down through these 8 levels of what is now CNN Studios and CNN Center. And so on that top level, when you first arrive, there were all these things that were like circus trailers. Like you'd go to a circus and you'd see a lion in a cage or a guy juggling or whatever. And one of them was a huge crystal ball where a ventriloquist, their head, they were through a table, their head was inside the ball, and they did a puppet next to it where the puppet talked to the head and like read your fortune. So they wanted a ventriloquist. So my friend Gary went down to audition for this. And at that point, when we walked into this massive structure, the Omni, the windows were all blacked out. It was under construction. In the first early, I guess that would have been the early part of that year. And the ground was all dirt, and they had built the outer structure, and it was a construction zone, hard to imagine.
Yeah.
And it was dusty, and there was noise and construction. So they were holding auditions in some little room there. And I just went down just to hang out with my friend Gary. I wasn't auditioning there. There was nothing there that I was looking to do. And so Gary auditioned with a puppet I had built. It was a puppet of a small baby. And he would do this ventriloquist thing where he would walk around with this baby all wrapped up in blankets, and he would do this baby crying, and you didn't see his lips moving. And then the baby would turn. It was a puppet, and the baby could talk and make baby noises. And it was a ventriloquist thing. So he used that puppet to audition. And I always traveled everywhere with my little trunk full of puppets. So I had it with me. And I said, if you want to use one of the other puppets, you can, whatever. I'm just waiting outside. And Gary came out, and I said, well, so how'd it go? Did you get the part? And he said, well, I don't know yet, but they want to meet the guy who made the puppet. And I said, okay. So, I mean, talk about being totally cool, calm, and collected to go into an audition, because I wasn't auditioning. I was just going in to meet these people. It was fine with me. So I go in with my puppets, and there's this table. I remember it being about 100 people, but it was probably only 3 or 4. Sid and Marty Krofft were there. and a bunch of other people, you know, producers and various people at a table, at a big, giant, empty space in a construction zone. And then you had a chair where you sat out in front of them. And I wasn't auditioning. I was just there. So I was fine. And they asked to see my puppets. So I had a few. One of the puppets that I had that day was a puppet of Kermit the Frog that I had built. And it was pretty bad. I mean, it wasn't a great Kermit, but I built Kermit because I built all Jim's characters, you know, his Sesame Street characters. And so I essentially auditioned for Sid and Marty Krofft with a Kermit puppet. I also had this character I built called Otis, who went on to do other things. But I remember them offering me a job right there that day. And they said, what we'd like for you to do is walk around the theme park with a puppet and just talk to people, just greet people and say hello to people, have conversations with people. And I thought, well, that's great. I can do that. And they said, and I remember, I think it was Sid or Marty said, but, you know, of course you can't use Kermit here. And I said, oh, no, I know that, of course. And I said, well, how about, and I had Otis, this other character that I pulled him out, and they said, maybe him, you can use him, you know, one of my characters. So the ironic part of that is, as you might guess, if you went into a theme park these days and auditioned for anything, no corporation would ever allow you to use your own character in their theme park. It's just no way, because they don't own it. And Sid and Marty were both fine in the late 70s or wherever this was for me to just do this. So my dream job, my first job was and I kind of gravitated after walking around the theme park for a while to the top level. And I became the greeter when people got off the escalator. It was me and a couple of the other people who were actors who would greet the guests and then send them on their way through the theme park.
Yeah, I've heard stories about people getting to the top of that escalator and getting bothered by mimes and whoever else was around there.
There were a lot of mimes. There was a couple of guitar players who would sing to you. And then oftentimes when I was on my shift or whatever, there was Otis. And I'll tell you an interesting thing about the experience in that theme park. One of the psychological things I learned in that theme park as an 18-year-old or whatever I was that because sometimes you have little kids come up and they were great, but they were overstimulated, excited, and they start pulling at the puppet. I had a kid pull one of Otis's arms off one time.
Oh gosh.
And there's only so much you can do when you're there. You can't, you know, you've got to still be the host of this place. You can't say anything or do anything. I just had to go repair him. So if I felt kids were spending too much time or they sort of needed to move on, we were done. Otis would end the conversation with them by talking, being nice, and then just saying, okay, well, thanks very much, bye. And 9 times out of 10, every child would say bye and leave, whether they were done or not. It was the weirdest. Somebody should do a psychological study on that. That they just, it's time to end the conversation, so they left, you know.
That's pretty good.
Yeah, it was great.
Did you get a chance to hang out there a lot, go on the rides or?
Oh yeah. And there were no real thrill rides there per se. It was, it's really interesting. My perception of what was going on there at about the 4-month mark, I guess, they did a major refurbish of the park. And I think it was doing pretty well at that point in terms of attendance. And they added, they changed the focus a little bit to be more live performers. A lot of local Atlanta young actors and actresses, not just young, but people, singers, were performing there. It was very, very much centered around performers. And the changes they had made had really improved the overall place. And then that was about the time I guess it was, and I could be wrong about this, but my understanding was it was out of state financing on most of this. Some of those people hadn't been to the theme park even. And attendance dropped when kids went back to school. And I think the point was it wasn't supposed to drop because it was an indoor theme park. It wasn't weather dependent.
Yeah.
But still, when kids went back to school, they weren't coming to a theme park. So that was my understanding of what I heard as to why it fell apart. But it was just really getting good. You know, it had really improved and gotten on its feet. And it was only about 6 months and it was gone, you know. We found out about it, a lot of us found out about it on the local news.
Wow.
Yeah, before I got to work that afternoon. They took us all into a room and told us it was happening, and we were horrified. We were, you know, everybody was, it was like, you know, we were all such enthusiastic people about the place.
Yeah, I'm sure, because it looked like a blast, and everywhere you turn, it's just something new that's just blowing your mind.
Yeah, it was a great idea. I think one downfall was that thing about kids going back to school, but that probably happens in any theme park. But I think the other part was refurbishing something in an indoor theme park. It probably didn't take any more work than you would at a Six Flags or something like that. But it meant you had a huge construction zone that was a major part of your place. It was a limited space, you know. But I remember it well. I mean, during the big grand opening night, it was just this star-studded event with all these big stars of the time. You know, I mean, major TV stars and movie stars. And of course, at that time, I don't know whether you have any reference to Burt Reynolds, but a famous actor who was really, really popular at that point in time. And he opened a restaurant also in the same complex called Burt's Place. And it were always celebrities. It was the celebrity place to go in Atlanta. So he, of course, was at the Krofft thing, and then all the Krofft celebrities afterwards went there. And you know, Jimmy Carter was running for president, and he came through with his family and his at the time young daughter. And anyway, it was great. I mean, it was such a heady time for all of us who were young people, you know.
Did you get to do your puppetry act with any of the celebrity guests that were there?
Well, yeah. And I, you know, it's funny that you put it that way, because I didn't really have any kind of an act. What I did was just what I have enjoyed most about my whole career, even with the Muppets, which is just to have a conversation with people, you know, improvise. I say quite often that my favorite stuff that I ever did with Kermit was when we would do these improvised appearances on, you know, the Today Show or something, and it wasn't scripted at all, and you could go with it. I always felt like the characters really, you know, I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but there's a distinction between the voice of a character and the character itself. And so often people confuse, because they kind of tend to think of it as animation in a way, the voice and the sound of the character, which is important. But what's really important is the depth of the character, of knowing who that character is. And the characters, to me, have always grown more in the improvising arena than when we do a film or something where there's a script, because you're kind of just getting through the material when you're doing a script. But when you're out there on a tree and you're sawing off the branch as you talk, and you've got to get through this appearance, you know, you have to, the character really has to come through, or people are going to say that wasn't that character.
Yeah, I've always thought that's kind of where the Muppets shine the most, because maybe not every movie does super well, but anytime any Muppet shows up on a talk show or SNL or wherever, everyone's like, oh my gosh, did you see Kermit was on Jimmy Fallon or whatever it was? And people love it.
Well, yeah. And you know, it depends on the show too. I mean, I used to love doing Jimmy Fallon's show. He's one of the nicest people on the planet and a huge Muppet fan. The last time I did it, we gave, and this was something I wanted to do, Kermit gave him the Muppet pipe wrench. I don't know whether you've seen that. But
no, I don't think I have. Actually, that does sound familiar now that you say it.
Well, there are these back in the early 60s, Jim used to go on, the Tonight Show was actually in New York at that point, and Jim went on as an act with the Muppets, and it was in the same studio where Jimmy is now back doing the show, minus the quarantine, of course, in New York. And the dressing room they were in, they would get there early in the morning, get all set up, and they would just wait to go on the show. So it was Jim and Frank Oz, a guy named Don Saleen, who was the original sort of Muppet builder, and you know, different people like that. And in the closet, there were all these building pipes that had a function, you know. And Jim, they got bored one day, and they went back and got a bunch of paint and fur, and they decorated the pipes like totem poles almost. They have all these faces. You can find it online.
Yeah.
And so when I did Jimmy's show with Kermit right after they had they had moved the show to New York, and he was new on the show. And Kermit's thing was, well, if you're going to, be the keeper of the Muppet pipes, then I have a gift for you. If you're going to do that, you have to have a Muppet pipe wrench. And it was basically this giant real pipe wrench with 2 eyes and a nose and hair, And I think they put it in the case with the actual pipes.
I do remember that now that you mention it, and I'd never known about those pipes until that
Yeah.
that bit on the Tonight Show. That's
Well,
great.
it's kind of ancient Muppet history. It's funny about those pipes because they do look like a cave carving, or like something the cavemen did on the walls of a cave. And now that the Muppets have such a long history, they really were near the beginning of the Muppets, so they're almost like that for real.
Yeah, ancient hieroglyphics of
Mhm.
Muppets past.
Yeah, a little bit like that.
I do want to talk about I guess there's probably some time in between working at the World of Sid and Marty Krofft and then when you met Jim Henson, but do you remember the first time you met Jim and how you got involved with the Muppets?
I do, and it wasn't a long time actually. That was high school, and then I just was a high school kid trying to get a job. Around that time. I mean, I once Krofft was gone, I just got odd jobs. I worked at a what you would have called then a record warehouse. I guess these days it's called vinyl, but it was the place where they have all those vinyls, And I just worked in the warehouse stocking these things and sending them out to the stores where you bought these things, stuff like that. But around that time, I'll go over this quickly, but as a result of my work at Sid and Marty Krofft, I had met a whole ton of local actors and actresses everybody was just trying to get work. And I was asked by one of them, a young lady at the time named Cindy Smith, who was an actress. She had gotten this gig at North Lake Mall, which is one of the local malls for people who aren't in the Atlanta area, to do an Easter show. So it would have been springtime of the year. And it was a thing for kids. Kids would come by and we'd be set up in the mall. And, it was her and 2 or 3 people, including my then girlfriend who became my wife, Melissa, in, like outfits. And they would do things with the kids, and the bunny, Easter bunny was there. But she wanted me to MC this show with this character I had done called Otis, who was the one I used at Sid and Marty Krofft. So I said yes, of course. Set up my little puppet stage, and they're all working out front. Otis I have a microphone, he's talking. We rehearsed this show at DeKalb Community College, which is where Cindy was going to school. And on the bulletin board, the night we rehearsed, there was this little flyer that was pinned up on this board for the Southeastern Regional Puppetry Festival. And I took that off the board, and I noticed that Carol Spinney, who was Big Bird and Oscar the Grouch, was going to be at this thing. And I thought, oh, that's great. I didn't know they did these things. I've got to go to this. I'd love to meet somebody who works for the Muppets. No thought of getting a job with the Muppets because I was doing my stuff. I was in Atlanta. I was going to stay there. But to meet somebody who worked for the Muppets was amazing. So I took this thing and I got real involved in the show. And I was also working on a couple other things that were happening in Atlanta with puppets. And I forgot, I didn't read the part where it said registration must be done by a certain date. So I missed it. So I was so bummed out. I mean,
oh man,
I missed registering to go to the thing where I would have gotten to meet, one of my heroes. So we go to the shopping mall at Easter at North Lake, and we're doing our little thing. We're not shooting, but we're doing our little thing. And at the end of the first show, this lady comes up and she's pushing, I remember pushing a baby carriage. So she had a couple young kids, and her name was Barbara Goetz. I think it was Goetz, as I recall. And she turns out to be the organizer of what they call the Potpourri Puppet Performance at the first night of this festival. So she was organizing this big show where all the puppeteers who would be there would do whatever they wanted to do. And Carol Spinney was going to be the MC of this show with Oscar the Grouch. So she just saw me do my puppet, and she came up and said, I think you should be there. And I said, you have no idea how important this is to me because I forgot to register. She said, well, don't worry about that, which means I didn't have to pay to register. She said, I think it was probably a fee. And so, but just, come up with your puppet act and you can be a part of the show. So that's really where it all began, my Muppet connection. I mean, you can watch the progression of it over time, So then I go with my friend Kevin and my brother Mark, and we put together a little puppet thing. There's an old song from those days, a novelty song called I Love Onions, which is this ridiculous song that a girl, it's like a woman's kind of sultry, seductive voice singing this song about loving onions. And you got all these background voices singing the background part. So I built these little onion puppets. And they were singing the background, and the female character, who was very well endowed and it looked like Farrah Fawcett at the time, she was singing the part. It was a stupid little number. It was very short. That's what I did at this thing. Carol saw this, and then so they had all these puppet walls set up. One puppeteer, next puppeteer, next puppeteer, next puppeteer, next puppeteer. At what at the time, I don't know what it is. I think it's a Fairfield Inn on Spring Street. The Admiral Bimbo, it was called at the time, in their conference room. That's where we did this, right down the street from the Center of Puppetry Arts.
Oh, wow.
Which was not there at the time, as a matter of fact. But anyhow, so that's how I met Carol. And Carol is the person who several months later called and said, hey, you know, I think you ought to audition for the Muppets. I'm going to set up an introduction. And I was on cloud nine. I mean, as you can imagine, I had not gone into this with any kind of expectation like that. But I was the only person at that performance and at that weekend puppetry festival at that point in time who was performing with puppets that were Muppet-like puppets. You know, the Muppet style, the hand and rod Muppet puppets with the two eyes and the simple look. There were a lot of marionette artists. There were some other hand puppetry artists, but nobody was doing Muppet-style puppetry. And I guess that drew Carol's attention, you know. So that was really the start of it.
Wow, it's funny. It's funny how that worked out. Just like getting the job with the Kroffts, it's kind of just these chance meetings that lead to big things.
You're absolutely right. I don't know. There are people who say things like that are meant to be, and you know, I can put some stock in that. But all of these things fell in my lap. I was strictly just going about doing what I was loving doing and enjoying it. And, you know, all of these little opportunities led up to this thing over the course of a fairly short period of time. It was like it got ramped up. I mean, it was within a year of, I wasn't even out of high school when I started working with Sid and Marty Krofft. So within less than 2 years, I had already become a part of the Muppets. Through all these different kind of stuff you're talking about. I think the word is serendipity, all these little things falling into place, you know. I mean, more of that, you know. It turned out that when I called up to the Henson offices, I talked to one of their producers. Turns out that Jane Henson, Jim's wife, who's a core part of the Muppets, was going to be traveling to Atlanta in a couple of weeks because they remember the big balloon in the Macy's parade of Kermit?
Yeah.
They still use it sometimes, was being built at the Goodyear plant somewhere in central Georgia. And she was coming down to have a look at it just kind of as an approval, you know, this looks good. So while she was in Atlanta, that's where I met her for the first time at the old Atlanta airport, which is now, it was like really different than the one now, before they rebuilt Hartsfield a couple of years later. So that was a coincidence, big coincidence. She was on her way to Atlanta for another thing, so I got to meet her.
Wow.
All that kind of stuff. And she, by then, I was doing a local show at WATL, Channel 36, which is still around. It's now affiliated. At the time, it was a startup done by a local Atlanta legend, a guy named Don Kennedy, who I don't know whether you're aware of who Don is. Talk about somebody you should do a piece on. He's still around. I don't know, you know, haven't had any contact with him in years. In the early 60s, he did a show for quite a number of years on WSB television called The Popeye Club with Popeye, the cartoon character. But he was Officer Don, and Officer Don had a little shack over here and what they called the Peanut Gallery, which was where the kids sat and little kids were on the show. It was a typical kind of, you know, afternoon kid show. And they ran the cartoons, and then he would, you know, be Officer Don. He had a puppet that popped up in the window of this little house. And I got to be on that show when I was about 6 years old and won a prize. Anyway, so Don had come across me at the World of Sid and Marty Krofft. He came through one day. I don't even remember this. And I met him at the top of the escalator, I'm sure, with Otis and talked for a while, and he moved on. I'm not sure I knew who he was. I mean, I knew who he was, but I don't think I recognized him. So some months later, he somehow got in touch with me. I don't even recall how, and said, I'm starting this, I'm reviving this Channel 36, this new station. And I wonder if you'd like to do a children's show on there. So again, I just got handed this opportunity. So the experience I had not had was working with television. I had done all my puppetry had been live. And obviously the Muppets is all television. You work with monitors, you work with cameras. I had not done that. So Don put me on the air 2.5 hours live, 5 days a week.
Wow.
Which is an enormous amount of time to fill with this character, Otis. And my buddy Gary, who had been down at Krofft with me, did 3 or 4 other characters, puppets that I had built, but Gary performed them. And my character, Otis, was kind of like the Kermit character. And he wasn't like Kermit, but he was in the center of the show. All these other characters would come in around him. And Gary did pretty much all the others. So we were on the air 2.5 hours live every day, taking phone calls from kids and sometimes adults who were in Atlanta. And it turned out to be, I mean, we weren't making any money. That wasn't the point. But it was hugely popular. The phone company tracked us getting like 2,000 calls an hour trying to get through to us. So it was an enormous volume because kids went home in the afternoon. They had nothing else to do. They could just pick up the phone and call, you know, all these calls trying to get through. But for me, when I look back on it, 2 things. One was that it gave me the chance to get some experience with cameras and television monitors. And actually, even though it was very low level production, really like I had never done. And I also continued to develop this character as well. The other part was that when it came time to meet Jim Henson, Jane asked me on that meeting in Atlanta if I was able to give her a tape of a videotape. And so the people at Channel 36 were able to help me put together such a videotape to send to Jim. Wow. So all of that kind of worked out nicely too.
Yeah, everything really just prepared you for that moment to be part of the Muppets. Everything before that was just like learning all of the things you need to know before you made your way to that.
And I still had so much to learn, but it gave me a taste of it. And it's such an Atlanta story, you know. I mean, it all took place right here, you know, in my hometown. And are you from Atlanta originally?
Yeah, I've always lived here.
So we're both native Atlantans, really. And, you know, and I think a lot of people don't know the extent to which there is a connection to puppetry here locally because of the Center for Puppetry Arts. There are other centers for puppetry, but not quite like this one. This is certainly, to my knowledge, the biggest place of its kind in the world. And it's a pretty impressive place, you know.
Yeah, anyone who hasn't been there and is living in the Atlanta area or is ever visiting here definitely needs to check it out because it's great. I hadn't been until maybe 5 years ago or so, and I was like, why have I not been coming here all the time? It's amazing.
I think right now, as we're in quarantine, I don't know what the status of what they're able to do is. I'm sure they do some outreach and stuff, but they used to do a thing. I think
they may be reopened now. I'm not 100% sure, but I believe they may be reopened.
Well, they may be. I know a lot of their work is with school groups, and if schools are allowed for kids to come in, I guess kids could come in there too, in theory. I don't know. But they used to do a thing, and I guess they still do it when they can, called XPT. And XPT stood for Experimental Puppet Theater. And it was actually, it wasn't for kids. It could get quite adult, actually. But it was all very sophisticated, psychological kind of, you know, performances. Some of it was silly. But what they would do is if anybody could come into them, whether you're an established puppeteer or not, and say, I've got this idea for a puppet show. And they would give you, I think they would give you a small amount of money to just like seed money to get it started. And you'd go out and you'd do like a demo show, like a 5-minute show or something short. And then they would have a night with an invited audience where a bunch of these people would then all do their performance. And depending on the response and whether, you know, they would figure out whether or not they thought it could be made into a bigger show. And I found those fascinating. You know, it was very interesting stuff, really artistic stuff. And I don't know whether they're still doing that or not, but I hope they are. It was a great thing.
Yeah, I was gonna say that sounds interesting.
Really cool. Yeah, it was the YouTube of the puppetry world in a way, because anybody can make a video and put it on YouTube.
Yeah,
But this gave people a showcase for live puppetry.
that's great. So, what was your getting back into? We keep going back and forth in
I know
time,
we're
but
jumping around a lot, but yeah.
it's fun though. What was your first project with Jim Henson? I gotta guess it was probably the Muppet Show, right?
It was. That was the Muppet Show went for 5 seasons, and I came around in the middle of the 3rd season, so I did the last two and a half with Jim on that show. And it's a funny thing when I think back on it. The Muppet Show came on the air during the time that I had already begun to work with Sid and Marty Krofft. So I'm going to school all day, high school, and every night I'm driving downtown. I was out in the Gwinnett County area, so I'd drive down and do my stint with Sid and Marty Krofft at their theme park till whatever time they closed, 10 or 11 at night, race back out to home, get up the next morning, go to school. So I had this schedule that was, pretty rough. The good thing I was young.
Yeah.
And what did not fit into that schedule was ever seeing the Muppet Show. And I was obviously a huge fan of the Muppet Show, but I never saw the show because there were no video recorders in those days. You couldn't record it and watch it later. You either saw it or you didn't see it. I remember one time seeing a piece of the Muppet Show. Somebody had like some weird little portable TV at Krofft. And on the night it was on, we had a moment to gather around and watch a couple minutes of the Muppet Show. That was my only exposure to it up until the time I went to work on it.
Wow, so that's kind of incredible.
Yeah, I had a huge Muppet reference because I'd always been such a crazy fan, but it was mostly about Sesame Street. And honestly, in all honesty, it gave me a bad impression of the Muppet Show. I remember it being one of the backstage scenes, and I didn't think it was very good. It didn't. I mean, I still loved the Muppets, but it didn't give me enough of a sense of what Jim was doing as a 19-year-old or whatever I was to think, oh, I love this, because I kind of didn't. I liked them better when they did Mana Mana on a variety show, or one of their standard bits, which they were doing in the Muppet Show. I just didn't know that. That moment I saw was kind of long and draggy, and I thought, oh boy, it's not. What are they doing? Well, go back to your other stuff. But of course, by the time I got there, I was so enthusiastic about being there. That was all out the window. I didn't care. I wasn't judging it. And my first thing with the Muppets was the Alice Cooper Muppet Show.
Wow, that's a crazy one to start with. That's a classic.
It was great. It was a good one because being 18 or 19 when I got there, I already was like this and an old hippie, and had such a reference of, I've been in garage rock and roll bands where we played concerts at school and around. We even got hired to play places, and I was the keyboard player and the lead singer, and we did a lot of Alice Cooper's music because he was very popular at the time. That was Alice Cooper and Kiss and all those kind of 70s people,
Yeah.
And we liked the theatrical people like Alice. So
yeah.
I showed up fresh out of high school, fresh out of playing in these rock bands where I was playing his music. So I think I probably knew more about Alice Cooper than anybody who was actually working on the Muppet Show, Jim or Frank or any of those guys, just because I was a big fan of Alice Cooper. So I met him and I got to, spend a little time with him. And he was very nice to me because I was this young kid who was clearly a fish out of water. And he was very, very, very gentle and friendly to me. And I had built an Alice Cooper puppet long prior to the Muppets. You can find pictures of this online. It was like Alice's head, and then he had a skeleton body because he used to wear this suit that was like a black suit that had a skeleton painted on it, And I'd taken that puppet to London with me, and Jim let me bring it on set and do a photo of me and the puppet and Alice.
Wow.
At that point. So flash forward, that was 1978. Flash forward to 2018, and I go to a Comic-Con where Alice is there. I take this puppet out of storage. It's falling apart, but it's still travelable. and I take it to this thing, and Alice and I restaged the photo.
Oh my gosh.
So 40 years, almost to the day, within a couple of months, Alice and I redid our photo where Alice and the puppet and me, 40 years
Wow.
apart.
If
So
I
that
can't
was
find that, I might have to get you to send me that, because that's too cool.
it's out there. It's out there. Yeah. It's, I'll happily send it to you.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
Wow.
What a cool memory, you know?
Yeah. I ran into him once at Dragon Con, and it was one of those things where they had him in a room, and
Yeah.
I didn't have money to spend on however
Yeah.
much he was charging, but just seeing him
Right,
walk
right.
by, was like, oh my gosh, that's him. It's a real guy.
He's one of the nicest people that I remember ever meeting. I have one more quick Alice Cooper story. Years later, so we've kind of like run into each other every 20 years or so, some weird thing. You know, we did the Muppet Show, and then at some point during the years, I think we were promoting Muppet Christmas Carol or something like that, and we had gone to London to do that. And you know, you do these promotion tours, and you do a lot of interviews at a lot of different television facilities, a lot of TV shows. So we did this show called the Ant and Dec Show, I think it was called, very popular British show. And we're at the BBC, and I'm in, you know, they give you a dressing room, so I'm there, and they gave us a large dressing room because there's always a lot of people who have to travel with the Muppets. It'd be me, it'd be the person who handles the puppet, sometimes more than one person. We got this giant box with the puppets in it. You know, the producer from Henson or whoever it was, you know, it's 5 or 6 people sometimes. And we had this nice room, and there was an old television in there running, of all things. I don't know whether you are familiar with the old black and white Andy Griffith show.
Yeah.
It was old at that point. I mean, it's double old now, but it was old even then. And for some reason, it was running on this television. So we were reminiscing about the Andy Griffith show at that point, all black and white TV and stuff. And I knew Alice Cooper was supposed to be on that show, but I didn't know he was there that day. But you know, you don't ever know whether you're there the same day as somebody else when they're taping a show. So all of a sudden, there's a knock on the door, and it's Alice Cooper. This is like 20 years after I worked with him the first time. And he says, do you guys mind if I come in and share your room? Mine is a tiny little cold, it was the middle of winter, freezing room. Could I share your room? Oh, sure. So he comes in. So I just kind of gently remind him of this experience back on the Muppet Show, like almost 20 years before. And he remembered, he talked all about the Muppets and what a big deal it was for him. And we had this long conversation. And then we both sat there together on the sofa and had this long discussion about how great the Andy Griffith show was with Alice Cooper. You know, Alice Cooper is saying, there's a character on there done by an actor named Don Knotts. The best thing in the show was Don Knotts being this character called Barney Fife, who was this bumbling sheriff's deputy.
Oh, yeah.
He was only ever allowed to carry one bullet in his gun. And it was just, he was so good, this character actor. And we just talked about what an incredible character that was, how great Don. Anyway, this long conversation. And then years later, you know, we ran into each other at a Comic-Con a couple of years ago. So
That's wild. Just because you look at Alice Cooper and you're like, oh man, rock star, but he's just a nerdy guy. He loves loves the Muppets, loves Andy Griffith. It's pretty cool.
And still touring. I mean, to this day, he tours and is still performing on stage. You know, with Johnny Depp, that group, the Hollywood Vampires.
Oh yeah, I forgot about that.
He's out there, and he does his own tour as well. You know.
Wow.
Yeah, terrific guy. And he's not a spring chicken, but his energy is amazing. And it has to be for him to perform on stage. I'm sure that's part of what keeps him so young, you know?
Yeah, definitely. So on the Muppet Show, I gotta assume you were probably the youngest in the group of the core guys, right?
I was. When I first went over there, I was about 19. I think I was 19. And there was one other performer there, a young woman named Louise Gold, who was worked on many things with us, but she was hired on the Muppet Show for a couple reasons. One, she was quite tall, and so she was able to work alongside Jim and Frank and Jerry and Richard, who were all about the 6 foot to 6'2" range, and so was I. So it helps when you're puppeteering in a group if everybody's more or less the same height. I mean, that's gone out the window these days, but at the time, Jim was kind of using that as a sort of a boilerplate, except for Dave Goelz, who is a few inches shorter, and he had to wear these super tall platform shoes. But anyway, Louise was there, and she also had an incredible singing voice. And Jim was always trying to find female puppeteers. He wanted women to work with the Muppets, but frankly, the humor was not male humor, but a very masculine kind of humor. It was a bunch of guys in a room, and you had to find the right women to fit into that and to be able to balance that. People like Fran Brill and Louise and a number of people since then. But in those days, there was only a couple of people. Aaron Oscar was another one who was around in those days, puppeteers. So Louise was there when I got there. And Louise is really only about 2 or 3 years older than me. But I was so unsophisticated and so green when I showed up in terms of I'd never really been out of Atlanta. I had no world experience or life experience. So Louise she just was more worldly. So she always seemed a lot older than me. And she was one of my best friends and still is. And she really looked after me as a young person showing up there. Very big sisterly, but I always called her my British mom. And I saw her, at the first of this year, I did a Dark Crystal Comic-Con gathering over in England. So glad I did it before COVID, just as it was about to happen.
Yeah.
And Louise was there, and we caught up after we keep in touch. We hadn't seen each other in a while. And I said, you were so much older than me back in those days. And she said, yeah, I think you're older than me now. We just, we're only 2 or 3, but we kind of evened out on our level of worldliness in a way, I guess. I don't know.
That's funny.
I was the youngest for sure.
It's good you had somebody to guide you through it, because it had to be intimidating going into, these are like the top puppeteers in the world at that time, maybe probably ever. And you're going into the big leagues like that.
Yeah. And as I say, I had so little experience, I was not an actor at all by any means. And I sort of knew the basics reasonably well of being a puppeteer. I still had a lot to learn. But these were, not only were this incredible troupe of puppeteers, they also already knew each other, knew each other's timing and chemistry, and worked very well together as performers.
Yeah.
But even more than being amazing puppeteers, they were the originators of the Muppets. Jim and Frank and Jerry in particular. Richard had come along a little later, and Dave a little later than that. But they were the Muppet originators prior to the Muppet Show. And then, people have said to me that I was a Muppet originator. But the truth is, a lot of people kind of only date the Muppets back to the Muppet Show. But there was a lot of Muppet stuff going on prior to the Muppet Show from the late 1950s.
Yeah.
That led up to the Muppet Show. It's just that the Muppet Show became the biggest thing in the world at that point. It was literally the biggest thing in the world at a time when there was no internet, and, just amazing. So as such a big phenomenon, there's a group of us who stayed a part of it since that time. And I think people think of those as the original Muppets. But really, the only Muppet that was the original Muppet during those days kind of was Kermit, who carried forward, But still, that's sort of the point where people start thinking of the Muppets as becoming such a big thing in the world,
Yeah, it was like the #1 show at the time, I believe.
It was huge.
Everything. Yeah.
Well, it was so novel. The rest of the world had not really seen much of the Muppets. We knew the Muppets in this country from Sesame Street, but if you were an adult and you didn't have kids, or you didn't watch TV with your kids, you probably hadn't seen that. So it was a primetime family show that aimed squarely at adults in terms of the humor. It was never meant for children.
That's what I always got to remind people, because so many people kind of associate the Muppets with kids, and it's like their first special was called Sex and Violence. It's not
Jim was really fighting against having been stereotyped as a children's performer because of Sesame Street. That's exactly right.
What was Jim Henson like? Because I know everyone has stories, so I was just wondering if you had a favorite Jim Henson story that you remember.
Well, he was a very, ordinary is the wrong word, but in terms of just his everyday sensibility, he was kind of a normal everyday person. And as an artist, he was just doing what he wanted to be doing. He did, he was ambitious on a certain level, but I think he would have done the things he was doing regardless of whether it had become super popular or not. And it just happened to, And Jim never was looking to be a puppeteer. Puppetry was just one of the things he chose to use because he wanted to be a filmmaker. And television was brand new when he was in college. So he wanted to work in this new thing, this new field called television. And puppets was one way he tried to do that. But he did a lot of short films, so amazing stuff. There's one out there called The Cube, which you might be able to find online. And stuff like that, Timepiece. He did all these short films, and he was really experimenting in television, and his puppets were an experiment. And they just happened to be the thing that people latched onto. As a person, he was very nurturing. By the time I became a part of the Muppets, I think he was in his 40s, and I think he was at a point in his life when he was kind of thinking about how the Muppets would go forward, and the idea of bringing in young people like myself who he saw some capacity to learn in and maybe had some limited experience, but he wanted to have those people come in before they had learned too much to be set in a style, because he really wanted to mentor and teach those people in his way of doing things. And at that point, it was more than just the basics of, you make the puppet, you hold the puppet steady, you make him look into camera, and he talks like this instead of like that. And those are all the fundamentals. But he was also starting the idea of mentoring people around that time in his methods, the way that he did things, and his sort of philosophies about the work. And he was, in a funny sort of way, without really consciously doing it, he was starting to teach people, or looking to teach people, I think, how to carry this forward. And whether he was looking to do that or not, he was doing it nonetheless. And I was just a sponge. I mean, I was ready to soak up whatever he had to offer. I was the perfect student for this master of something to be using as an apprentice, because I had no preconceived notions, and I would never have questioned anything he told me. I was in awe of him, and I just wanted to learn everything he had to teach. So it was quite a good relationship in that way.
Yeah, every story I've heard, it sounds like he's as great as you would have imagined, just very soft-spoken and didn't raise his voice and that sort of thing from what I've heard. And
I never saw any sign. He'd get frustrated sometimes about things, but Jim's way of being frustrated about a situation was to kind of just say he was frustrated. He didn't raise his voice. I never saw him display a temper, on any level. I mean, certainly, out of control was out of the question, but I never saw him. The most he would do if there was a situation where there was something frustrating going, he had to confront something, was to just talk more directly about it, like the tone of voice you and I are talking now. I never was able to see very much anger in him. He was more concerned about a situation than he was angry about a situation, which made him a great person to work with. I never thought about that I was working for him, even though that's technically true. I was working with him. And, the Alice Cooper show is a great example. From the moment I walked in the door, Jim didn't put me on a level and everybody else was on. I was already able to talk to the guest star if I wanted to, and be a part of the whole process and collaborate from the moment I walked in the door.
That's impressive, because nowadays they'd be like, okay, new guy, you need to
just shut up and stand over there till we need you. And I guess part of the reason why it worked out okay is because I was more likely, my own personality at the time was to shut up and stand over there and wait, so I wasn't trying to be so intrusive, and I was very enthusiastic and just waiting for whatever they wanted me to do. I was there to do it, so I was a kind of a perfect intern, only I was getting paid a little bit to do it.
It's just so exciting to get invited to a seat at that table, especially at that time.
Oh yeah, it was the perfect time to learn under all those guys and learn their kind of specialties in the puppetry that they did and how they did it, stuff like that.
Yeah.
You know?
I wanted to ask about one project in particular, which I always think is an important. It's one of my favorite Muppet projects, but I also think it's kind of an important one. Is Muppet Vision 3D
Yeah,
that's at the at Disney World,
sure.
because it was Jim's last Muppet project, I believe, and I think it
Yeah.
it may have been Richard Hunt's last Muppet project, and
Yeah, pretty close. Pretty
and
close.
you are kind of a big star in that show as well, because you play Bean Bunny and Waldo C. Graphic, and
Right, right.
they kind of steal the show in that. So I was wondering if you had any stories about working on that one.
Well, Waldo was always a challenge. We first did Waldo on a show called the Jim Henson Hour, and it's a testament to Jim's really his enthusiasm about embracing every new technology he could find and finding ways to incorporate it into what we were already doing. Waldo at the time was real time, quote, real time on screen, along with the other Muppets, but he wasn't rendered. He was a wireframe. And so the eye movements and all the stuff he did was all done after the fact. And it took about 6 months to render all that. They had this giant room full of computers that took forever to do this work. You could probably do it on your laptop now. And it was this massive thing. I had my hand in this thing, which recorded the mouth movements. And then we had this long arm that went down to like an elbow and up again. That was, it must have been 10 or 12 feet long, like a 6-foot arm and a 6-foot other piece that attached to the computer. Computer guy sitting there, a guy named Rex Grinion. And he's adjusting and so I would go toward camera, this elbow would bend in the arm. I'd come back, it would move back, and it was all recording all this movement. But that was brand new. Nobody had done that before, to try to mix something like this. So he was literally the first real-time CG character ever on a television series. And they recorded my voice, of course, live as we did all this stuff. And the puppeteers, if they were, he was chroma keyed on top, and they would follow him around. And when he got bigger, it looked like he went toward camera and he'd come back. A lot of that was just faked, So by the time we were doing the 3D movie, he was a perfect character for that because he was so easy to make 3D for the glasses, So that was fun. And then Bean just had a lot of silly stuff to do, being the reject, he was downtrodden little character, And I did a lot of other stuff in it too that was, my first original job with the Muppets, which carried through all the way through with Jim's years, was almost, it was like an understudy, but I was a stand-in for somebody like Frank. If Miss Piggy was in a scene and she had a lot of dialogue, I would do Fozzie because he couldn't do both of them at the same time, and then he would dub the voice, Or in Jerry's case, if Robin the Frog was in a scene and Floyd was there, I would do Floyd or something like that. And so it gave me the opportunity to really learn to analyze the puppetry styles of every single other performer, because they're very different. Because it was really important to me, for whatever reason, this struck me as being important, that when I did Fozzie, it needed to look exactly like Frank was doing it. There shouldn't be any difference between when Frank took it off and handed it to me. He needed to move in exactly the same way. You should not be able to tell somebody else was doing it. So it was really important to me to analyze, and they all had different styles. Jim was different than Frank, was different from Jerry. They were all different. And so I was able to learn all that. And I think all of that went into me being able to develop my own, amalgamation of all those styles.
Yeah, people don't really think about that. I know Muppet fans do, but a lot, like you said, a lot of people say, "Oh, Steve Whitmire voiced Kermit," and it's like, he didn't just voice him.
Yeah, people don't understand, and I understand the misunderstanding, but when people talk about a voice being good or bad or something, they don't understand so often that the voice may be good or bad, but it has nothing to do with that. Ultimately, the voice is, just 10%. It's really all about, especially with the core original Muppets, it's completely about the character. Yeah. And sometimes, the Muppets miss the mark these days, and it's because of it's character. It's missing character. amongst many, many other things. It's people who have done the best they can, who are excellent performers, but they don't necessarily understand the depth of the character because they weren't in the room with the men who did it originally. And I say this a lot. A lot of people have heard me say this, but people talk about Jim Henson's legacy. And I distinguish that, really make a distinction between a legacy, which always feels like what Jim left us when he died, a body of work. That's his legacy, as well as his philosophies and so forth. But I think the Muppets are a lineage. And the difference for that, if you, any discipline, like whether you're a musician or a painter or a martial artist or any of these things are a lineage tradition. You learn from someone else the basics, and then you evolve that into your own styles. And that's what I went through, the lineage of how Jim did things. And I think unfortunately, it's pretty much lost, that lineage feeling. And I think it should be the same for the core Muppet characters. Now, new characters are a different story. You can develop your own character, but the others needed to be continued, if they're going to be continued, being passed one to the next in a singular individual sort of way, which is what happened with me. And it kind of isn't that way anymore. So when people say, oh, the voice of this character, I can't stand it since it's changed or whatever, that there may be truth to that. But the reason you're not able to accept the voice is because you're not seeing the truth of the character. And that's what's going to keep them alive, or unfortunately not, that's the sad part.
Yeah. Hopefully not the case, but yeah,
well, it's hard.
I know what you mean.
There's kind of a perception that, and there's different levels of fandom too. There are the very discriminating fans who really follow the Muppets and really know them. And then there are the more casual fans, which is probably the broader fan base, who just see a Muppet movie or a thing once in a while, and they kind of have certain traits they expect in the characters. And frankly, if it's green and it hops around, then it's Kermit, and anyone could do that. But there are things about Kermit that people don't realize they're missing until they're gone. And that's unfortunate. It's too bad that has to happen. So the real discriminating fans will see the difference. They'll know, and not just Kermit, that could be any character. We'll see the differences between Frank's characters and the new versions of those characters. It's less a continuation and more a new version in many cases. And that's too bad. It's too bad that the characters will go on, but likely be not quite true to what made them such a giant success all those years ago. The evolutionary chain of it is broken a bit.
Yeah, I think a lot of that has to do with the writing too. Sometimes a lot of the people who come in and write Muppet projects aren't necessarily Muppet people. They're I wrote a little something and here you go. Like Josh Gad wrote a Muppet thing. They're not making it now, but it's like, oh, who wants to write a Muppet project? And it's like,
and with all due respect to so many talented people, sometimes the more established and bigger name that a producer or writer is, the less likely they are to get the Muppets, because they do a certain thing in a certain way, and they might get hired to develop a project, but they're developing a project that is faithful to them. And they've seen the Muppets, and they know about Kermit, and they know about Miss Piggy, and they understand this thing, but they don't really know who the characters are. So they'll write something that might be funny, but it's not necessarily true to the characters in a way that the fans will respond in the same way, especially the fans who really know the characters, Yeah. That's easy to happen.
Yeah. Going back to what you said about when the voices change, did you experience any of that when you took over the reins as Kermit? Did anybody have, I know there wasn't, there might have been internet, but there wasn't message boards, and people weren't able to express their opinions on things as much. But did you experience any backlash from people like, hey, that's not how Kermit sounds, or Kermit does this? And
there was a little bit, but mostly we were concentrating with a group of us who were doing this stuff, to try to think about ways for my voice to match. And for me, it was really a matter of, I mean, anybody can do their Kermit voice, but it's funny how the voice mattered less, because I was able to kind of draw on, you know, we just lost Jim. He had just passed away. And I had worked with him on pretty much everything he had done over the 12 years that I knew him. And I was always there, you know, in the room next to him while he was doing Kermit. And it was, what I started really doing was thinking about what parts of Kermit were actually characteristics of Jim's versus stuff that kind of extended beyond the things we saw in Jim into being really only Kermit, more or less. But an awful lot of Kermit and the way Kermit acted and carried on was Jim. And there were little ways, patterns of speech that Jim used in his daily life that transferred into Kermit. And when Jim was ad-libbing with Kermit and improvising in particular, he talked much the same sort of tempo and little asides with Kermit that he would do if you were sitting and having dinner with him. And that goes back to what we were talking about a minute ago about the lineage thing, because had I not known all of those Jim Henson traits and how they overlapped into Kermit traits, I think it would have been so much harder, because the voice would have been all that was scrutinized, you know. And if I was able to do anything well, it was to zero in on who Kermit was. And once I was able to draw from my experience of Jim, and to a large degree, I was acting Jim. Frank said that to me once in the early days. You know, he said, you already know how to make a puppet work, but, and I was already thinking this anyway, and he confirmed it for me. He said, you have to become Jim to a certain degree, because we all know that's the only way it's ever going to be Kermit. And you knew Jim and you were around Jim and you know what those characteristics are. So that made it possible. There wasn't a lot of public problem over it. It went relatively smoothly. And by the time I was doing Muppet Christmas Carol, which was the first big project we did after Jim passed away, I felt like I had dialed it in pretty well. Now, if you played my voice alongside Jim's from that film, it's different, of course. But I knew who Kermit was. And that was so well written as a part for Kermit, the Bob Cratchit role, that I was able to really let Kermit come through, you know.
That's a great movie. That's still one of my favorite Muppet movies, because I think for my generation at least, we grew up more on Christmas Carol and Treasure Island and that sort of thing, and then went back later and realized, oh, there's even more Muppets to be had.
Way back, yeah. Well, it's interesting. In my mind, it's a whole process. It's just part of the performance process that can happen with puppets. I don't think it always happens with any puppets, whether it's Muppets or something else. But I felt like, I always wanted to do this, when I was watching because we always work looking at monitors, as you know, I'm sure. And we've got the puppets up here, and we're really not looking at the puppet very much. We're looking down at the screen, right? And I would always have Kermit look directly into the camera and relate to him looking directly at me. So I tried to separate myself from him on a certain level when I was performing him. And that became kind of an exercise of something I would do as I was working. And if I believed what I was seeing was separate from me, I knew I was doing a reasonably good job. And in this weird sort of, you know, mentally strange way, I got to a point with Kermit in latter years where when Kermit was talking, he's up here, I'm down here, and I'm watching him, and I'm seeing this thing, I started to just forget that I was doing the puppet in a funny sort of way. You know, I wasn't thinking about that I'm doing what I'm watching here. And my mind would kind of separate from it. And I would literally find myself in the middle of talk shows where I've got, you know, Jimmy Kimmel or Jimmy Fallon or, you know, somebody, you know, firing questions at Kermit. And I have no idea what Kermit is going to say next, not a clue. And it never enters my mind. It's almost as though it's happening and then I'm getting it. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
It's very weird. Kermit was literally speaking without me thinking about Kermit speaking. And I don't think it's easy to get to that place. It takes a long time to get to that place. You're no longer thinking about, I'm running, all of the technical part of the puppetry is gone. And this character is just alive, not just for the audience, but for you too. And I would just sit back and watch the show. You know, I don't know what he's going to say next. You know, it was an amazing experience. And I would love, and unfortunately I didn't have the time, the chance, but I would love to have had the opportunity to try to teach that to other puppeteers within the Muppets and elsewhere. And I may elsewhere. But I think it's teachable, and I think it takes a lot of experience, you know, to get to that stage where that character is so alive that you're now the audience of your own character entirely.
Yeah.
You know, and I think that's when Kermit really started to just really dial into being, you know, still based on Jim's Kermit, but moving forward in a progressive sort of way. You know, have his old traits, but coming up with some new ones, you know, as we move forward.
Yeah. Did they I doubt they had auditions for Kermit necessarily after Jim passed, but how did that process go in finding who would be the new Kermit after Jim passed?
There were no auditions. Evidently, I mean, I worked with Jim for about a dozen years at that point, and we worked closely together. And, you know, I think I stood in for Kermit once or twice, but that had nothing to do with it. Jim was at the point where he was selling his company to Disney at that point, and that fell apart, as you may know. But in 1990, he was selling the whole company. And he was coming in very much like, if you know who John Lasseter was with Pixar, as a new creative sort of force who would be installed in Disney, and he would have all this opportunity to do all these projects. He was going to be just creating. And of course, they wanted the Muppets to go on. He did too. So my understanding is he thought that he might become so busy with other work that he would no longer be able to perform Kermit. Gotcha. So apparently he had gone to his wife, Jane, and my understanding is I think he may have said it to Frank, just a handful of people, and said, in the event this happens, you know, I'm not saying it's going to happen, but in the event something like this should happen, I'm thinking that I might ask Steve if he wants to try it, wants to become Kermit. So, but he never said this to me. We never talked about it. There was no indication that this would be happening, because he was toying with the idea. He hadn't decided he was going to not do Kermit anymore, or even get somebody else to do Kermit. And then, of course, within a few months after that is when he died. So I was asked to do it based on that. I was asked to give Kermit a try. And I was offered the option of saying no. You know, if you don't want to do this, we understand, kind of thing. But I said yes, and it was really, really an intimidating thing to say yes to. You know, you've got Jim's most well-known character in the world that is the most associated with him, this leader of the Muppets, who directly translates into being the leader of the company, of the puppeteers, everybody. So it was very hard, but that's kind of how it came about.
Yeah, I guess it helps though when you know that he had you in mind, and if he thought you could do it, then I guess you kind of know, like, maybe I can, maybe I am up for the challenge.
Well, it gave me a little bit more confidence, I think. But I keep repeating myself a little bit, but it all boiled down to the time I'd spent with him. Had I not been in the room with him and in front of him so often and playing opposite him when he was doing Kermit, it would have been impossible. There would be no way that I could have done anything faithful to what people know as Kermit. And it's real interesting. People get into, I see a lot of discussions online with people saying, you know, this version of Kermit versus that version of Kermit versus this other version of Kermit. And I always reject all that. And I don't mean to just say it's understandable. I know why people are doing it. But that is an entirely objective point of view of this. That is looking at Kermit as a thing out there and saying, well, he was done by this guy, this guy, this guy, this guy, this guy, whatever. And I never looked at Kermit that objectively. I looked at him subjectively from the inside out. And as far as I'm concerned, and maybe because of this experience I was just talking to you about where he suddenly was not me anymore, I really came to the conclusion that Kermit existed in the world separate from me and separate from Jim. People weren't thinking about Jim Henson when they were seeing Kermit. They were thinking about Kermit. They weren't thinking about me when they were seeing Kermit. They were thinking about Kermit. And because I was able to carry it on with that lineage, I think people pretty quickly accepted that it was still Kermit, you know? So when people say, well, this version and that version, I just say there is no this person's Kermit and that person's Kermit. There's just Kermit. And if it's not, if you're thinking versions, then you're not really thinking Kermit. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
You know?
definitely. And then it's interesting with the Muppets because they're really the only characters like that where you see them out in the world and you think of them as beings. They aren't just characters. It's, oh, they're playing a part in this movie, but here they are for real. And there's not really any other character like that. You're not like, oh, there's Charlie Brown for real. It's like every the characters feel like actual people out in the world.
Well, that's right. And I think that's because they're puppets, for one thing. They're not animated. I think as a fan, we all know that you can look at them, and if you were in the room with them, you could shake their hand or you could touch them, or they are a physical thing. You know, people say, well, they're not real. Well, actually, they are real. They're puppets, but they're real. They are a thing. You know, they're a physical object. And we forget about the fact that there's a person underneath making them work, and we just suspend that disbelief. But they do exist in our actual real world. They never were, I mean, the Muppet Show was kind of their world, but it was a real world setting nonetheless. And they had humans there. So because they've always interacted with human beings and because they exist in a version kind of our actual real world, and in some cases in the actual real world, I think we think of them as being just, you know, citizens of the world.
Yeah. And like you said, it helps they're not animated. You can't see the actor playing them. And
Right. Well, and also over the years, as we've done so much promotion with them, I think they've grown to have a life off screen that has established that even further, which means that sort of storyline needs to stay realistic too. You know, there's the story within their films, and their films are so close to being sort of meant to be sort of almost like real life to a certain degree that it all needs to stay consistent. And that's a lineage too, really, if you think about it. You know, things evolving over time. You know, the difference between change and evolution. You know, change is just, okay, I'm going to change it now. Evolution is things that become different because they're based on something and that's still a part of them, you know. And I think that's how the Muppets need to be handled. And unfortunately, I'm not sure that's still going on exactly. You know, there's nobody around these days. Dave is still involved, but I think he's less and less. And you know, there's no one actually involved in the Muppets that can be in a position to put forth Jim's influence in it. So there are a few people who knew him, but they're not in a position to really put that forward. And so who knows whether the Muppets will last? I don't know. Frankly, I'd almost rather see them kind of not last than to exist and not be who they are. And I think the secret to that really is new characters, you know. I always pushed for the new puppeteers coming in to be given the opportunity as soon as possible to develop their own characters.
Right.
Don't put so much emphasis on, we've got 5 characters. You know, Disney was very much about Kermit, Piggy, Fozzie, Gonzo, and Animal. Well, those characters, they don't all actually fit together. Animal wasn't really around Piggy and Fozzie very much because it was Frank. You know, he was kind of separate, and he was never not with Double Negative, with the Dr. Teeth Band. So then, I mean, him as an independent person who moves through the world really didn't happen. And as
Yeah,
soon as
I always thought it was weird that he was one of the top 5, because I think it's more so that animal merchandise sells you like a t-shirt with
yeah,
animal on it with a funny
yeah,
saying, but he's not
yeah.
necessarily a character that you're going to have a storyline around necessarily.
It was a character direction based entirely on marketing data, and
Yeah.
not on characters' points of view, not on characters' relationships. So, you know, I mean, all that stuff's going to happen, but yeah, it was very weird, very weird. The minute, you know, Floyd always had animal on a chain. The minute he wasn't on a chain anymore, to me, it didn't make sense. He was an animal. He was a dangerous fellow. You know, keep him on a chain. You know, he doesn't go to the store by himself or out with other people, particularly. You know, it doesn't make sense.
Yeah. Were
Yeah.
there ever any projects, and not necessarily with Disney, but
Yeah.
just in general with the Muppets, that any projects you ever worked on where you're like, this really isn't working? I mean, we got to
Yeah.
finish it, but it's not really meshing. It's not.
Yeah, sometimes a script can just not quite hold together, and the characters may be, you know, pretty much in character, but it's maybe just not a great story. But with some of the more recent stuff we were doing, it's not so much that the characters were all wrong, although in some cases they were wrong. It was that we could have done the same story, you know, and added little twists and turns here and there that would have kept them more being who they were. I had a real kind of a problem with Kermit living in a mansion in Hollywood. I thought it was all wrong. Jim always maintained, as did I, that Kermit lived in the swamp when he wasn't working. He went back to the swamp. I maintained that for years and years and years before we did that particular film. And I really so hard tried to get them, if they needed to do it from the other characters' perspectives, I just tried to come up with a way not to alter the story, not to say your story is terrible.
Yeah.
So how can we do this so that it gives what you want and still is true to Kermit? I had this idea that Kermit would be, there would be a lot in Hollywood that has this thing that looks like a big mansion. And when you walk through the front door, it's a Hollywood flat. So from the outside world, it looks like Kermit lives in a mansion, but actually he walks straight through the door, like an old Western set in Hollywood. He walks straight through and jumps in a pond. I thought that solved the problem. And when Walter and Jason Segel and Amy and those characters came in, they think, wow, Kermit lives, it would be a silly joke. He lives in a mansion, but he doesn't actually live in a mansion. You know, he's there because this is what Hollywood people do, and I have to play the game, and, you know, kind of thing. I thought that was so much more Kermit.
I like that a lot, actually. I never.
Yeah, it was in character, you know, it was in character. And yet from the point of view of these 3 fans who migrated to Hollywood to meet him, it still serviced the story. There was so much of that. I felt like the idea that the characters were separated in that film was a little odd. I know why they did it. They wanted a device where they could show all these different things that the characters were doing.
Yeah, the real get the band back together kind of story.
Yeah, but my fundamental problem with it was that on a very fundamental level, it felt to me like while the characters might be off doing other things, the reason they were separated is because they had disagreements. That to me felt wrong. I could see a situation where Kermit would say, you know, you guys go off and Gonzo, you're going to do, you know, vaudeville theater, and Fozzie's going to do a stand-up. All of that would be okay. And those were funny things. But I had a real problem with the reason that Kermit and Fozzie had a fight. There was no way. There was no way those 2 characters would have a fight.
That's true.
It just made no sense to me. So why did we have to do that? You know, I mean, stuff like that. So it wasn't that I thought the projects were bad or that the people doing them didn't have the absolute best intentions for the Muppets and love those characters. I just felt like the stories could have been formed into something that stayed a little more in character for what we would expect from all that we already know about the Muppets, you know?
Yeah. I definitely understand that.
Yeah.
I will say, I think Muppets Most Wanted maybe gets it a little closer.
Yep.
After I rewatched both of them recently, and I was like, I forgot how much fun Muppets Most Wanted is, and the songs are just great. And That
Well,
one's
I agree. I agree with you completely on that. Other people might disagree with us, but I felt like we did a story there where it was a true Muppet story. I don't recall an awful lot in there that I would say was out of character. Um, Everybody was reacting and conversing and dealing with each other as the Muppets deal with each other on a caper. It was very much like Muppet Caper. You know,
yeah.
it was a story like that. Um, I thought our human co-stars were amazing, every single one of them. I never loved working with anybody any more than I loved Tina Fey.
Oh, I
Um,
bet.
it's so much fun, and
She's great.
so good. Yeah, yeah. I bought Kermit being locked in a prison. I bought Constantine taking over. It just all worked for me. And that was, and it's nothing about Jason Segel, because Jason is a wonderful guy. I loved working with him. He wasn't on the second one, but everybody else was the same team, So it wasn't
Yeah.
like, oh, those people don't know what they're doing. They needed one under their belt to figure out what they were doing, in my opinion. They were all qualified, upstanding, top of the line A-listers. But the second film is stronger in terms of the characters,
Yeah, I think
Yeah.
that's just the way you got to do it with general audiences. If you
Yeah.
just threw Muppets Most Wanted at them, they're like, "Wait, what's going on? Why is this
Uh,
happening?" You got to
yeah.
reintroduce them and do
Yeah.
all this. But
Yeah. Exactly. Exactly.
yeah, yeah, there are things I really like in that 2011 movie. Like "Pictures in My Head" is a
Yeah.
great song. I think that's
I agree.
tearjerker.
I
Yeah,
really like the song, and in order to justify that particular song, they had to be separated. And in order for
yeah,
it to be sad, it may have added to it if there had been some tension. But I wish, if there was going to be tension, I wish it could have been sillier and not quite so dramatic. And I also
right.
think they could be separated for reasons other than a falling out. And
That's true.
while I think the setting for that song suits what was being done in that film, I think you could have done the same song, maybe with a little bit different take. Maybe you could have shot it in a different way that I'm now, I don't know what that is, but he could have still been referring back to pictures of his guys, of his friends. They're separated. They're not angry with each other. There's just no work. So they had to go their separate ways,
Yeah, they
something like that.
moved away, and
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. Anyway, it's all hindsight, but at the time I was pushing for some of those things, and it just wasn't possible to break into the creative time of that,
yeah. Are there any Muppet projects that never ended up happening that you really liked, but never got off the ground?
There are, and I'm not going to describe the project to you, um, but I was in the process of developing a project that was going to be pitched to the studio within a few months of when they sort of kicked me out the door.
Wow.
And I had been told, yeah, we've got you on the calendar. We're going to do it on this date. And easy for me to say because I'm sitting here now, but I believe, and I say this with absolute sincerity, and I'm trying to say it without any arrogance, I believe that it is the project that would have saved the Muppets, because of the story, because of the depth of the story. And I was working with a couple of other people on it who really, really, really knew the Muppets. And it was a chance for the Muppets to do, once again, the kind of, not the same story, but to reestablish themselves in the way that the very first Muppet movie did.
Yeah.
What you would call an origins story for a new group of people, for people that are your age, for a new audience, to start them down that road again. Because I believe that that's the point in time. Muppet Show, Muppet movie. It was like the creation of the Muppet universe. There was a big bang, and everything started spreading out. From that little time frame and those little projects, and it's just moving, and it's getting slower and slower and slower and slower. And then we got about 40 years out of that success, doing some other things that weren't that successful, but everybody wanted the Muppets because of that initial big bang. And they tell me, scientists say that the theory is that eventually the universe expands, but it starts to come back in again. And I think we're at that point. But I think this would have extended that further. It had a real sense to it that felt a lot like the original Muppet movie. And I think it would have changed things. And I would still love to see it produced, but it never will be. I don't think it ever will be. And no, it wasn't put up the red curtains and do the Muppet Show again, although I think that would work too. It wasn't just some simplistic, let's go back and do everything we've done before. It was literally doing something completely different.
Man, I'd love to see it. I'd love to read it. Just
yeah. Well, we only had an outline. We hadn't done a script, but we were going to pitch the outline, and I think it would have changed things a lot. And that was about the time. This was just after the ABC series, and the ABC series had kind of flopped. Whether you like it or not, it didn't work for the mass audience. I think there's some great things in it. I think our puppetry in it was outstanding. I think the actual moving of the puppets and the acting and performance was amazing. I think the show was too subtle. And it was just getting to the point of where we were going to get really good with it after that first, dozen or so shows when they canceled it. They didn't give us the time to keep going. Another story. But but I think we could have bounced back if we had been able to pull off doing this. I'll call it a movie, but I think it would have been better if it was a limited run series.
And now they have the perfect platform for it. It would have.
Yep. Well,
would have been a slam dunk.
Yeah, at the time it might have been a Netflix thing, but now maybe Disney Plus. I don't know. I don't know the statistics on Disney Plus. I would have wanted to see it done, had I had any say, on a large enough distribution base, if that's the right term, like a Netflix, where it would really get out there to people in the way that a movie would at the theaters and then being re-released on a DVD,
Yeah.
But I mean, I would still do that project if Disney would let me come in and do it. Even after all the craziness and all the seeming bitterness in the press and all that stuff. Not because I feel I need to go back and work with the Muppets, but because I think the Muppets need this kind of a project, and it would turn it around. I still think it would turn it around.
That would be phenomenal. I mean, I'm all for any Muppet stuff we get, but when it's something really good, that's all the better.
Well, that's the thing, and when you say that as a fan, you're a pretty serious fan, and a lot of people are saying that they're what you just said. They're for all the Muppet stuff they can get. But it would be great just to knock people's socks off again. Instead of just saying, okay, well, we got another thing, maybe it's good, maybe it's not good. There's some good things about it. There's some not so good stuff. There are reasons. It'd be nice if we really did something, and I say we like I'm still there and I'm not, but if we did something amazing, and I've got it on my desk, but it'll never happen. It's too bad.
Wow. I'd heard about another project. I don't know what era this would have been, but Frank Oz, I guess, wrote one.
Yeah.
It might have been called The Greatest Muppet Movie Ever or something similar, where they spend all their budget on the opening number and then have to figure out how to fill the rest of the time. Is that ringing a bell? I don't know if that's exactly how it went.
Yeah, I think the general original idea, this was a concept put together by Jim and Frank and Jerry Jewell back in 1983 after Muppets Take Manhattan. And it was to facilitate a couple of logistical things. One was they wanted to do simpler things that cost a lot less because the films were getting more and more expensive. And I'm projecting this now. Nobody said this to me. That to make a cheaper film means you make more profit. So if we can do a good film that's cheaper, it'd be great. So the actual title was The Cheapest Muppet Movie Ever Made, not the greatest.
That's what it is.
It was going to start out, they had, and the whole premise was they were making a movie, as well as I remember. I never saw the script, but I heard about it. And they were going, and as they continued to make the movie, they were going to keep running out of money. So they had to keep shooting on cheaper and cheaper film formats, 35 down to 16 millimeter, some of the movie, and they would actually shoot it that way and it would look grainy and terrible. Then they would get down to Super 8. And by the end of the film, they have no money and they're just, they're barely getting by. So So as an overall direction, that's what was going to happen. As the story, it was a different deal. But they were just about them running out of money trying to make a movie.
I love that. That's such a such a Muppety concept right there.
Yeah.
Because you couldn't do that with just any old movie. That's such a Muppet idea.
Yeah. Well, and it's what Frank was trying to revive within Disney at the point when the 2011 The Muppets movie happened, the Jason Segel film happened.
That's right, because wasn't Frank Oz trying to?
Yep.
He didn't like abandon the Muppets. He kind of got pushed out as well.
Well, I don't know about that. I think it was perhaps a function of that Frank was really wanting to be a film director, and I think there was suddenly a move after Jim's death to really get out there with the characters, and in much the same way it carried over to Disney, because it's all my fault, because I was able to keep Kermit going reasonably well. And so I think the perception was, well, if we can keep Kermit going reasonably well, then we can keep them all going reasonably well. And for a long, long time, Piggy just got passed around amongst performers. Now, Frank was still dubbing the voice, but it finally came down to a situation where they said, well, we're going to have to get Piggy out there, so we just got to get somebody else to do it because Frank is doing other work and he's not available for everything. So that's a lot of it. I think Eric's great with Piggy, but I'm not sure it was the smartest thing to do. I think what I think should have happened is that we should have gotten another sidekick for Kermit at that point. Other characters should have surrounded Kermit. So Kermit ties through like he often did. And we put less emphasis on characters that and then Frank could come in and do his characters when he wanted to.
Yeah.
I think that would have been great. And I'm not saying that in any way as a slight against Eric. I don't mean that at all. I just think that it would have been a great idea to continue to create more characters. And frankly, I think that's the way Jim would have done it.
Yeah. Well, like you said, when it's a new character, it feels fresh. When you bring in here's Pepe. When he came up on the scene, you're like, oh, This is something new. This is kind of exciting. And that keeps it going. And then if Frank was still doing his characters, it's like, oh, look who's back. That's a nice little treat. And now we have see them interact with these new characters that they haven't met yet. And it's,
And so Piggy could have been largely serviced even if another puppeteer was manipulating her, because Kevin manipulated Piggy in an outstanding way. Kevin was the best puppet manipulator of Piggy, second, as a stand-in, not as an understudy, not as a voice, not as take over the character, none of that, just to stand in for Frank. I mean, I did it and I did okay with it, but I was doing Kermit. I couldn't do it. So Kevin was really good at it. And he did a lot of Piggy in Muppet Treasure Island. And then Frank dubbed it. And then some scenes Frank did. But that could have serviced Piggy as a character in a lot of Muppet work for years. Frank pops in when he can and he dubs it when he can't, and we keep the character consistent. I see no reason why Frank couldn't still be doing Piggy. Piggy right now, if Frank did Piggy, I haven't heard him do Piggy's voice in years. Would it still sound the same? I don't know. His voice might have changed as he's aged. However, if his voice had changed slowly, we wouldn't care. Piggy's voice had changed. It'd be okay.
That's true. It's like that with a lot of it's like that with some animated characters. If somebody plays the role for long enough, there was an example I thought of recently, but I can't think of it now. But you just go with it, and it all works out.
Yeah, and I think if Frank had directed, and because we had meetings, we were really moving in the direction of doing this film, and then it was sort of abandoned to do in the other direction, to do the other film. The all of what must have gone on behind the scenes for that, I have no idea. Just speculate. All of you speculate to your heart's content. But Frank basically was sort of pushed aside, and that's a real shame. We should have done that film. That's another film that could have really set the course of the Muppets for a long time to come, because you had Frank Oz back. He would have been doing his characters. That's a little dicey because Eric was already established in them. I have mixed feelings about that, frankly. But it would have been the best the Muppets could have done at that point to do a really true to the Muppets successful film. And I have to say, and I've never said this to Frank, if he's watching, I'm not saying it for that reason. I haven't been in touch with Frank in a while, but the meetings during the development of the Cheapest Muppet Movie version 2 around the thought of remaking that film were the most exhilarating for me of any project I have been involved in since Jim died.
Wow.
And that had been a lot of years, because Frank really wanted to collaborate with Dave and Bill and me on this film. And at that point, and then there was Eric, and Frank sort of knew his characters, so Eric was there, and Eric was contributing. It was a little bit different because Frank was planning to do his characters, and Eric might have felt a little left out. I don't know, but I recall so vividly sitting at opposite ends of a table where there was Frank and me and then the other guys, and we're talking about Kermit's role in this film, and it was the most exhilarating collaborative experience I had had since Jim was alive. Because Frank really wanted to know what I thought Kermit was capable of doing within this film. And we debated some ideas. It was fantastic.
Wow.
And it would have netted an amazing Muppet film. We're at a point when the Muppets really needed one.
And that's got to be a big difference when it's a collaborative effort like that, because I assume a lot of times it's just you get a project slapped on your desk and they're like, hey, this is the next thing.
Yeah.
Are you in? And
well, a lot of that was going on. Yeah, a lot of that was going on. And it was always very dicey to say, well, yeah, of course we're in. We're definitely in. But what do you think about taking your great idea and doing it this way? Because it would be more in character. There was so much of that. And sometimes there was a little bit of receptiveness, but more often than not, there wasn't, you know. There was a lot of just hit your marks and deliver your lines and get your money and go home, you know. I'm saying from the opposite point of view, none of us wanted to do that.
Yeah.
You know, we wanted to make it the best it could be. And I think that oftentimes, I understand it. It can be interpreted as people who are just always making trouble. And we were doing it in the nicest way we could. But, you know, a big company is, you know, a big Hollywood company is not, unless you're hired as an actor and an executive producer, which happens to, you know, Jason Bateman and people like that, you know, but it didn't happen to us. We were just the guys who needed to do this. So just do your part and we'll come up with the ideas and the scripts. And so just the polar opposite of the way Jim worked, you know. And so it just never gelled. But I will tell you this, and I really mean this. I believed it then, and I'm not sure whether I believe it's possible now, but I always felt that it was entirely possible for the mom and pop kind of small Jim Henson collaborative bubble group, that it was entirely possible for that set of methods and principles and ideas and way of working that could be installed within a giant company like Disney. There's no reason why it couldn't be. And it would only enhance the more corporate side of it, because what we would be doing would be coming from this great little artistic side that would either completely ensure success on all levels, which is the corporate concern, or at least give the Muppets their best chance towards that. You know, important. That's important. And it just was such a foreign concept to work in the way that we needed to work, that it just couldn't be installed there, you know. And now there's really nobody who will stick their neck out to, even in the nicest way, try to get that installed. You know,
I'm sure, especially now, people are not.
Yeah. You know.
Yeah.
After my whole thing 3 years ago.
Yeah.
I can't blame them. I mean, they've got kids to feed and, you know, stuff like that. I mean, nobody wants to get fired over being outspoken, but it's just too bad. You know, I know people out there don't understand. They don't know me, and they don't know how I would deal in a situation like that. So it's, you know, one person's word against another. But I was so patient and easygoing with those guys about it was all about trying to gently educate in the way that Jim did. Jim never said, "You're an idiot. What did you just do, Steve? What did you just do?" He would say, "Okay, try that again." And if you tried it again and it was still just as bad, and you didn't know it was bad, he would say, "Try this." And he would make you try it. He never told you what to do. He helped you learn how to do it. And that's all I ever tried to do with the executives and the creatives. And they didn't appreciate it. They just didn't want anybody telling them what to do sometimes. I get it. I totally get it. It's too bad.
Yeah, I agree. Do you still talk to a lot of Muppet guys, a lot of the performers, or
I haven't had a lot of contact recently. Some of that's a function of being so busy with what I'm doing, and they're all busy in their own personal lives and trying to cope with, quarantines of their own. And, they're still working. I mean, Sesame Street's still out there for a handful of the guys. The Muppet work is out there. But I haven't had contact in many months. I think it's mostly a function of just the logistics of all our lives,
Yeah. I will say,
I was going to say,
you go
oddly,
ahead.
one of the people I have the most contact with is Bruce Lanoil. And I haven't had contact in a while, but some of the people that were, might not, I mean, they're excellent, outstanding performers. They've been with the Muppets forever, but they were often overlooked for major stuff. And one of my goals with guys like Bruce and Misha Sisti and those people was to try to bring those really talented people in to do more work when they were being overlooked by people who might have had more, aggressive is the wrong word, but more outgoing personalities and were trying to get the work,
Right.
And plus they're the nicest guys in the world to work with. And, same with new puppeteers, the puppeteers who were around during the time I was there, people think of them as being young puppeteers, but they weren't really any younger than me, but by only, a little bit. I was actively looking for truly young puppeteers, people who were college age and in their early 20s, starting out, trying to bring those people in to be the next generation, to find, if it's necessary, to find that next Kermit or whatever. It doesn't do any good to hire somebody who's my age or if I keel over, they're not far behind. We need to find the new people.
Yeah.
So to answer your question, no, I haven't had a lot of contact. I know everybody's doing their own thing, and we know, but frankly, even with Dave, who I love, and we've been friends for years, we never had a lot of contact outside of work, and we were the best of friends and so tight knit when we were in the studio. We didn't correspond a lot. We didn't call. We didn't send emails. None of that stuff. Not very much. And then when we got back together, it was like we never went our separate ways. It was this is our family of choice when we're at work, and we have our other lives otherwise. And there was a kind of a separation, not for any reason except that we all lived in so many different parts of the world.
Yeah. I will say Bill and Gene Beretta do a show on YouTube now, or I don't know if you've seen it, but they answer questions sometimes, and somebody mentioned your name and asked, what do you think about Steve Whitmire? And Gene said, I miss him. That's what he said. He said, misses having you around. So I thought that was nice to hear.
Well, that is nice. That is nice. I mean, it wouldn't surprise me if it's a tough question for them to answer, because Bill still works with the Muppets. I mean, what's he going to say?
Yeah. I
It's
thought that was a good answer, a pretty good answer, because like you said, you don't want to ruffle any feathers, I guess.
Yeah, it's too bad. I mean, I was ruffling feathers without knowing I was ruffling them to the extent I was ruffling them, I guess, but without somebody to do that, and without the right person on the other end listening, it's going to be really hard to, Jim's influence is lost to the extent that it needs to be there. Not with the fans. I mean, fans have a different viewpoint. If you're the people who are moving the Muppets forward, that influence needs to be a part of this. And what happened with me was, because of Kermit and because it was so tight on the end of Jim's life, and because we were trying to keep it going if we could, and because I knew Jim, it really became like a research project for me. It was like an ongoing research thing where I was really analyzing all those kind of intangible things I knew about Jim and how he worked and what he did and the way he did things and why he did them. See, that was a different thing. We hadn't thought about why he did them that way because he just did them. It was his natural way. No one had ever thought about really the details of why Jim did things the way he did. And then you have to translate that to something you could say in a corporate boardroom to executives. You can't just say because it felt good, because it seemed right. You know, that doesn't work to the bean counter. So you want to present these things honestly, not with some false expectation. You want to do it in an honest way that says, and this is why the Muppets worked here. This is why the product works. So your product that you're marketing is going to be good if we follow these simple guidelines to keep them who they are. Every project we do needs to be looked at through the eyes of the characters, not through the eyes of what network it's going to be on, how much money it's going to make. You guys take care of that in another department. But from a Muppet point of view, it's always going to be about who they are. Yeah. And if we don't get that right, and that doesn't consistently continue to go, we're lost. And we're a little bit there, you know. That's too bad. So that's the thing that's important about it, you know. And I appreciate Gene saying that. Gene was always one of those people who
it was Bill who said it.
Oh, I thought you said Gene. Well, and Gene was great too. Gene was always around as though he was a part of our group, even though he kind of wasn't, you know.
Yeah.
But he was a part of the family. He didn't have his hand in the air, you know, in the same way. I know. Bill, second to Dave, and I mean this as no slight against the other performers, but I probably enjoyed in the latter years working with Bill as a performer more than anybody else. And Dave always, but I'm just saying there was something about, especially when we were doing Gonzo and Rizzo, Pepe and Rizzo. And when we got the three of them together with Gonzo, that was terrific too. But you have these two little guys, and they're both just they get annoyed quickly, you know, and they're like a little dog that yaps all the time. And Rizzo thinks Pepe's crazy, and Pepe thinks Rizzo. I love the two of them living together, which is one of the things I like that we didn't get into as much as I would have liked to in that last series. That element, I loved exploring that. Those two guys in a house together, oh my God, you know?
Yeah.
My idea was always, we never got to it. I wanted Rizzo to be, if you're familiar with The Odd Couple, I wanted Rizzo to be the one who's kind of OCD. You know, he insists that all the socks in the drawer are lined up, and he wants all the cans in the cabinet to be arranged with the labels forward. And he really doesn't. It drives him crazy to live with Gonzo. And Pepe's just too insane. And guys, come on, I just cleaned this, you know, geez, you know. I'd love for him to be that character because he's a rat, and it's exactly the opposite of what you would expect.
Yeah.
You know, being the rat who eats pizza and is always nasty and dirty, that's what you expect. I'd love to have played against that type, you know.
How is it with like an original character like that? Because did you, I'm going to show my ignorance here. Did you create Rizzo on your own, or was that sort of like, oh, here's a character that we like and Steve can play him?
Well, it's a mixture of all of that. There was no character of Rizzo that was written into a script, so that they said, here's a new character we want to do. We'll get Steve to do it. And when I started out, I had no clue how to develop the character. So it was in terms of the character himself, he developed largely due to the writing team on the Muppet Show and moving forward. And they would always, you know, it was very collaborative. So they would ask me and I'd say, I don't know. You know, I don't know what I'm doing. I may not have said that because I might have been too embarrassed, but a lot of it was me just trying to read the lines and get through it in the early days. And because it wouldn't have been my idea for Rizzo to be the leader of the Union of Rats. That would have come from somebody like Jerry Jewell or one of those guys who was writing the show. And so he started down his path largely because of other people. And then by the time we got to Muppets Take Manhattan, that was about my 5th year with the Muppets. And Jim used to always say, it's just something he said. He said it generally takes people about 5 years to get accustomed to the way the Muppets work and the way I like to do things. And I had no idea what he was talking about when he said it in the early days. And it, sure enough, it proved to be exactly true with me to the year, because we started doing Fraggle Rock and suddenly I was ready to develop a character. And that summer we did Muppets Take Manhattan. And I brought what I had learned from doing Wembley and Sprocket back to Rizzo. And Rizzo was suddenly a fully fledged kind of character, you know, who could hold his own in a scene and be a strong guy. I'll never forget the first time Rizzo laughed Frank wasn't around for Fraggle Rock, so I've been off doing Wembley. And I show back up and suddenly I could make a very sharp distinction between Wembley Fraggle, who has the same voice as Rizzo virtually, but I made a distinction. And the first time Rizzo ever laughed in the movie, it was kind of like Wembley. And Frank said, "Oh, that's great, that laugh." He came running over to me and said, "You got to do that a lot. Find reasons for him to laugh." You know? And I thought, well, I can do that. And it's basically Wembley, you know?
Yeah. Rizzo was kind of in that top 5 for a little while there in the 90s, it seemed like, as far as like Christmas Carol, he's huge in there. And shoot, well, they still have Rizzo big on a whole pizza place dedicated to him at Disney World right now.
Yeah, exactly. He's still around. And, you know, I don't know what the status of him being recast is, but that one is hard for me to take because he was such a part of me. You know, so somebody can do a rat voice and they can call it Rizzo, but it will never be Rizzo.
I was gonna say I don't think he's shown up in anything since you've left. So,
well, it's probably harder. There are cliches. A cliche is the wrong word. There are traits that can be assigned to Kermit, and if you watch every YouTube video there is of Kermit, whether it's me doing Kermit or Jim, you will see certain traits. And you know, Kermit's a nice guy, and he's an everyman, and he is nice to Piggy, but he gets irritated with her, and then he'll get angry. There's you know, you can list him like a spreadsheet, and you can say, okay, well, if I do these things, it'll be as close to Kermit as it can be Kermit, and it won't be. Rizzo's a little bit different because I know where Rizzo. He's not really different, but I know where I was headed with him. Like I just told you stuff. If somebody got into that mindset, they wouldn't be into that mindset like I was in it. And if somebody gets into Kermit's mindset, or even Statler, or even Link, or Beaker, they're not into the mindset in the same way that I was. It's now left to be a version, a copy, a mimic. And it's very hard for that to expand into the character, especially off the bat, to expand into the character that we know, you know. So it's hard. And Rizzo's a real good example of that, you know. It's the same with Wembley. Wembley, I think he's out there. I haven't seen any of that stuff. No disrespect.
I was gonna ask her, do you have any involvement in the new Fraggle Rock stuff? Wow.
No, I think it's fair to say that the Hensons aren't going to ask me to do anything. I don't think that's controversial to say that. So no, I'm not involved in Fraggle Rock, and it's very hard for me. You know, because that's the character I cut my teeth on. Wembley was the first character that I really, as it's an interesting way of putting it, came out with. You know, he was the first, and more than Rizzo, and every inch of him is me at that point in my life. And so we went back and did a thing at Carnegie Hall at one point with all the characters coming together some years back, 10 years ago or more. It was all the various Jim Henson franchises owned by different people come back to do a show.
Wow.
And it's the first time I was asked to do Wembley because the Fraggles were there since the show. I mean, it had been a lot of years, 25 years at least. And I thought, God, I don't even know that I can do the voice anymore. And I put Wembley on, and he just came back to me. He came to life. And I realized that character never left me. And, you know, there's no learning these characters from watching all the YouTube material that's out there. You just can't. I have so much respect for our fans, people like you and people who love the Muppets. But it is always a different point of view. It's an objective, outside point of view, no matter how well you know them. You don't know them the same way as the originators know them from the inside. We have the luxury, and it shouldn't be up to the fans to know that. They shouldn't have to think about that stuff. It's something that the people who are producing the Muppets should know, like, like, you know, their guidebook. And if you don't know that, and as fans come in and begin to get the roles as the characters, they're going to be different because the only point of reference is not their interiors. So it's unfortunate. And that, again, that's nothing against any of the puppeteers or against the fans. It's just that they need guidance. They need guidance because they don't have a reference. And that's part of what I was trying to provide. Off camera, behind the scenes, unpaid, separate thing, trying to provide a little bit of insight into where those characters came from within the original guys, because that was my job. My job was to learn those characters. It wasn't like, oh, well, now Frank Oz has died and I'm going to do Piggy or Fozzie. No, Frank Oz is standing right there. And now I've got to do Fozzie while he decides whether I'm doing it well. So, and if him or Jerry or Richard don't like it, they're going to say, that's really sucks. And now you have to do it better. So it was boot camp, and so I really do know a lot about those characters, even though they were not characters I inherited. And my desire was to pass that along to the new guys so that they can in turn someday and pass it along to somebody else in a way that was never anticipated by the original Muppet performers,
Right. Yeah. And that doesn't seem like it'd be something hard to implement. It's not like the Muppets are constantly doing things. There's time in between projects, and you can really get to know the characters and pass them along that way. And
well, it's really, really hard. You'd think so. Problem is that if I came to you today and I was still doing Kermit and I said, Disney, I think Wesley is the next Kermit the Frog, and you have puppeteering experience and you're reasonably good at it and you really do show potential and you've got a voice quality that matches and you're going to get to spend the next 20 years with me, or let's say 12 for the sake of matching Jim, and learn this. Well, what are you going to do in the meantime? Because you're being hired as a, quote, understudy to eventually become Kermit the Frog. So as long as I do it, as long as I'm still alive, you're not going to be doing Kermit the Frog. If we stick to what we need to stick to, you're just going to be this guy waiting in the wings. Well, you're not learning anything. You're just watching Steve Whitmire. That's a waste of time. And in theory, you're getting paid to do this. So you're going to want to pick up some other puppets and do some other characters. And if you haven't developed your own character in 12 years, you're probably the wrong guy anyway, right? So by the time you've developed your own characters and become a core member of the group, you're no longer available to do Kermit. So the whole venture is the wrong way to go. And this idea of understudies is exactly the wrong way. It's just as wrong as auditions. They really need to be a linear passage, and you something a corporation's not going to do. But we weren't ready for Jim to die. We were not in a position where I was trained by Jim to be Kermit formally. And yet I did Kermit for 27 years. So he survived, and he survived intact, and he survived with a lot of Jim still coming into him. And I was able to make that work. So it can be done, and it could be done again. And I know it's not corporate thinking, but I am convinced that it could be done again when the time comes,
Yeah, I definitely think so. I hope one day they figure out everything. And I think there's bits and pieces of that in each project where that magic is recaptured. But I was going to ask before I let you go in a little bit.
Sure. Yeah.
Have you watched any of Muppets Now?
I haven't, because I don't have access to it. I've seen the promos that were done, and people keep telling me things, but I haven't really seen any of it. All I've seen is their marketing stuff they put out broadly beforehand.
Right.
Honestly, I'm sort of interested in hearing from fans about it, and I'm hearing what they think. And it's pretty much what I would expect.
Did you know any of the stuff? Were you involved in Muppets Now at all before it? Okay, no, I didn't know how far they had been planning it or anything.
I could speculate on so much of how it got to fruition, why it happened, and I might be right, but I'm not going to do that because I also might be wrong. How that project would come about based on the lack of success of the ABC series. Just what I know of it from descriptions, I could already tell you that if I had read those things in an outline, I would be saying, before we produce this, I can tell you these things are not going to work and be true to the characters. So could we go ahead and start off on the right foot and change this part? But I think the idea of the Muppets doing a show on Disney Plus makes all kinds of sense.
Oh, yeah.
The broad concept of using them there makes a lot of sense. But I mean, I can't speak about it very intelligently because I haven't seen it. But I've read the criticisms, and when I hear the people criticizing, I immediately think, as a fan, I know why your criticism is happening because I was on the other side of that. You know?
Yeah.
I know why you're saying what you're saying, even if as a fan, you might not quite know why you're saying it. I know how it's at that stage. You know, I get it.
Yeah. Right. Well, before I let you go, I'm going to let you tell us a little bit more about Cave In. I know we talked about it at the top, but tell us all about it and where we can watch it and all that good stuff.
Sure. Well, Cave In came about because I was wanting to really do a character that would allow me, and it wasn't designed to be the character it turned out to be. I wanted to do a character in some way that allowed me to do a inexpensive, ambitious project where I could get back to doing what I did as my first job with this character we talked about called Otis. I wanted to interact with the world, at least have the opportunity to do that. And that's what Cave In became. If you haven't seen it, then Cave In is this show where this character basically does the equivalent of taking phone calls, even though we do it on a Discord server. It's like taking calls. People line up and we ad lib. None of the banter between me and those people is written. And I love it. And sometimes it's funny and sometimes it's not. Sometimes it falls flat. But that's the chance you take whenever you do anything improvisational, unless you're better at it than me. But it's my favorite thing to do. So Weldon happened because I thought it just came together because Weldon, the IT guy, IT is internet troll. He's a physical manifestation of a troll. It's not a particularly clever idea. It's kind of obvious. But so many ideas that I have done, character ideas, come from, I just have this flash in my mind of the look of a character. I don't know what it's going to be. I don't know how it's going to be used, but I know, and evidently people tell me who worked closely with Jim, he was the same way. He would send them a sketch and say, I don't know what this is, but I like the design. Well, I work the same way. I'll sketch something and I'll say, that'd make a great puppet character. And that's how what became Weldon was born. It was an idea for a little chubby character with big teeth and horns who had skinny little arms. That was all. I just thought, someday I'll do a character like this. And the idea of doing something on the internet at a time when I could portray him as a hacker, as hacking in when he does his show. My website was the perfect opportunity for me to get hacked because Weldon could be as mean to me as I want him to be. And I, so I couldn't choose a real person and say, do you mind if I pretend to hack your website and be really cruel to them? I didn't want to do that. So he can be as mean to me as I want him to be. And nobody can say anything. So it was a perfect storm, for that part of it. And then we started doing these things and I thought, well, yeah, but a puppet sitting there talking endlessly could get pretty boring. And what if we don't have any phone calls? Well, we have tons of phone calls now. There were a couple of shows where we didn't have any calls, like show 2, I think. And it was like, what am I going to do? Okay, I got to keep talking. We're live now. And so we started doing these kind of production numbers, I would call them Jim Henson style production numbers to slap in the middle of the show. So we have something to go to so I can rest my arm for a second and something entertaining. Well, I built Weldon myself. So I only really had one puppet. And I thought, it's going to be a challenge to do whole production numbers with one puppet, but that's what I said I was going to do. You know, a lot of green screen work, a lot of matting, a lot of building virtual sets, none of which I had ever done before. I mean, I'd done it in the context of the Muppets, but I had never been the person doing that work. There were always really qualified people who did that. So I had to learn all that. I mean, I'd done a lot of shooting over the years and editing, and I was pretty proficient with that. And I just, you know, I still to this day, if I want to do something really ambitious, we shoot it, and I shoot all the pieces that I think are the elements, and then I figure out how I'm going to do it. I don't always go into it knowing how I'm going to put something together. I sit down at my laptop and I figure it out. So the whole show is really all me, except for the help of Jim Lewis, who will, if I want to write something, he will look over the material and add to it. And it's just priceless to have him willing to do that. But again, that's usually Weldon's comments, like answers to viewer questions. And I need for him to open the show. I write more and more of this, but I'll get Jim to punch it up and make it funnier. And then I have Liam Nelson, who's also an Atlanta native, who runs New Haven Studios, New Haven Productions. And technically, the space I'm in now is where we shoot Cave In. It's his space. So we do our live stream from here. And he does a lot of other work on a lot of other things. He also runs all of the equipment. And we're about to introduce a character that weird character we had on the show, called Trollbot 9000. Trollbot is meant to be Weldon's computer. And so I'm going to build a physical Trollbot 9000 who will be coming soon. Will sit there next to Weldon. And he won't necessarily talk like with a voice, but he will express things to Weldon. So he'll become a character, basically. Not a puppeted character, but an electronic thing that sits there. Anyway, so Weldon takes phone calls and he wants to talk to people about the most miserable thing in their lives because he's a troll. He's a miserable guy. I've described him as a cross between Oscar the Grouch and Rizzo times 10. I try to keep the material PG enough that anybody can watch it by today's general standards. We could have gone completely in the other direction. We could have used every 4-letter word in the world and got cheap laughs. And I thought, it's on the internet, but I don't really want to do that. Why do that? It's not necessary. I'd rather do a deeper character and let him grow. And he has. We've been doing this for a year. So I don't know when you're running this particular show, but we're at August right now. We're about to do our 1-year anniversary show in about a week and a half. And we got all kind of little pieces we're introducing. So, you know, and I'll keep it going as long as I can. There are other projects I would like to develop and do. Some of them will consume a great deal of my time. Unfortunately, there may come a time when I just can't keep doing Weldon because it's too labor intensive to keep him going in the way that he's going. But we'll see. We'll see what happens, you know. I hate to bring him this far and then just abandon him, you know.
Yeah, I encourage people to check it out, though, because the production value is insane when you realize it's not like the Muppets where it's like a huge crew of people, but you really have made some pretty amazing stuff.
Well, I appreciate you saying that, especially since I know you do a lot of shooting and editing yourself. And it's really a testament to, it's not about the number of people and it's not about the crew. And it's not, although it oftentimes is, and it's not about the equipment you have because we did invest in some equipment, but it's mostly about just the imagination of doing something bizarre and just sitting there till you figure out how to make it work well enough. You know, some of our stuff looks kind of cheesy. And Leo and I made an agreement early on that cheesy was okay, that Weldon is meant to be putting these pieces together himself, sitting alone in his cave. He's a recluse, you know, kind of guy. So, which is really what I am when I'm editing. So if it looks a little tacky, that's okay. That's okay. And some of them look really pretty amazing, you know. I mean, you can see green screen lines, you can see little things that I did, but that's okay. That's okay. I don't mind. I think the important thing for me was for it to be effective storytelling. You know, it's good enough to get the point across and for us to do our silly parodies of things like Stranger Things and stuff like that, you know.
Yeah, it's the perfect character and the perfect vehicle for doing stuff like that. Like you said, if it looks cheesy or you see a little bit of this, a little bit of that, it doesn't matter because it fits the character.
It does, and it's a real workout for me because, as I say, I have one Weldon puppet right now. And so one character. So when he's playing opposite himself, it's me playing opposite me. And that is a real challenge to do that on every, you look at we did one, I brought up the Stranger Things one, we did one called Stronger Thongs. And it's Weldon being every character, almost every one of the main characters in Stranger Things in a parody. So it's 4 to 5 Weldons dressed differently, playing different characters on screen at the same time, all shot separately and all pieced together in Final Cut Pro. I have nothing fancy.
Wow.
And it kind of works. I mean, there's even a place where 2 characters, I won't give away the joke in case you haven't seen it, but one character grabs a slingshot from another character right out of his hands in real time, and we did it without a cut. So stuff like that, figuring those things out. That's how Jim worked. You want to do something nobody had ever done before? He figured it out, you know? And I love the challenge of that on no budget.
Yeah, it feels very cutting edge too, making use of Discord and just a lot of stuff that you didn't have to do it like that, but the fact that you took the time and figured out how to do it, like most people would not do a live show like that and let anybody call in and put themselves out there like that. It's really a testament to just the love of puppetry and the love of improv to do something like that.
Well, thank you for saying that. It is what I love doing, and I approach Weldon the same way I approached Kermit or any of the other characters. He's a real guy who lives in the world, and he's separate from me, and he is who he is. And so you get, what you see is what you get. And he is who he is. So, if it's funny, great. And usually there's some humor to it. And I always enjoy talking to the people, and that's where all the material comes from. So I'm going to keep doing as long as I can, but you can find him for his live streams. The best thing to do is to follow me on Instagram. And right now, that's my primary place of promoting it. I think I said earlier, I'm about to launch a new website anytime now. You'll see things about it there. But that's I consider that more of like a business card. You can go in and see past stuff and things about me and stuff like that. I'm also on Facebook, but I monitor that less. Instagram's really the place. And you'll always know about the Cave-In shows via Instagram. So Steve_Whitmire, you can follow me there and you'll know about when Weldon shows are going to be. And then the shows are broadcast on Weldon's YouTube channel called Cave-In. So you can just search that, or you can search his name on YouTube. And everything we've done, every episode and every production number is separated into a separate playlist. You can see it all.
Yeah, and I'll leave some links down below in the description of this so people can check it out.
Thank you so much for tuning into this very special episode of Quarantined Conversations. I want to once again thank my guest, Steve Whitmire, for spending so much time with me. It was absolutely incredible. Make sure you subscribe to Cave-In on YouTube so you never miss one of Steve's live shows, and follow him on Instagram as well. I'll leave the links in the description below. Also, make sure to subscribe to our channel, Viewist, for more exciting interviews and episodes of Nostalgia. You can also find us on your favorite podcast apps now, so check that out, and we'll see you next time.